Let me start with Dr. Cillea. And I would like to start with the current story now, the story of the Central African Republic, South Africa over the weekend, sending about 400 troops there. Firstly, I would like to know from you, Dr. Cillea, what is South Africa's motivation behind that?
There's been quite a lot of speculation about this because South Africa does not have overwhelming economic or other interests in the Central African Republic. But it does seem that it's twofold. On the one side, we've had a training mission of around 26 trainers in the Central African Republic for some years, I think since 2006. So we have an existing arrangement to help and assist. And given the situation in the Central African Republic, the rebel Seleka alliance advancing, President Bozizé is desperate for assistance. And I think South Africa feels that the African Union, African countries should ensure the stability, the territorial integrity, the control of the Central African Republic by President Bozizé. He is an elected president, and is concerned that if South Africa or some other larger African country does not undertake this mission, that what would happen is that France or the US or some other foreign power would intervene, and there has already been calls for that to happen. So given the fact that we have an existing agreement for training and DDR issues, South Africa has strengthened its existing presence under that mandate, but of course that serves as a clear warning that if the rebels would continue the advance, that they would meet what seems to be quite a battle-ready force, relatively small, but certainly that would probably be able to ensure that President Bozizé is not overthrown.
All right. Let me bring in Dr. Adebayo. Your speculation on why South Africa would have sent the 400 now?
I think I agree with Yaki that the main motivation seems to be that it has a bilateral relationship with the Central African Republic, which it seems committed to bolster. And it's important also to note that some of the regional states under the Economic Community of Central African States, led by Chad and other countries, have also provided some troops earlier to the mission. My own main concern, though, for South Africa, and I think it's also worth noting that, this is also part of South Africa's peacekeeping history. It sent troops to the DRC and to Burundi earlier on, and it still has troops in the DRC. But my main concern is that this situation is a fast-evolving situation. The number of troops there may not be sufficient, and even though Bozizé may have been elected, there are a lot of allegations of both manipulation of elections and also not observing previous peace treaties. So there is a concern that South Africa could get embroiled in a situation which spirals out of control.
But let's talk a little bit about South Africa's concern, not just for the Central African Republic, but for the West African region as a whole. I just want to know again from you, Dr. Cillea, whether you think that this is an ad hoc step or is this part of a strategy? What is South Africa's strategy in terms of peacekeeping, not just in the West African region, but across the continent?
South Africa is a large peacekeeping contributor, but not one of Africa's largest contributors. That goes to countries like Ethiopia, Nigeria, and so on. So we make contributions in the DRC and elsewhere. What has been interesting is the extent to which South Africa has particularly sought to engage itself, in particular Francophone countries, Burundi, Central African Republic, its concerns around Côte d'Ivoire, and South Africa does not have clear strategic interests in this, and one almost gets the sense that the country is trying to downplay its relative economic and original military support and strength and influence by engaging in conflicts in areas that are really not on the mainstream. We are, of course, involved in MONUC, but there seems to be a lack of consistency and engagement. My sense on the Central African Republic, of course, is that we have the Mrs. Dlamini Zuma is the chair of the African Union. And since South Africa, she's very aware of the South African engagement and probably more easily call on South Africa to strengthen its existing engagement, given the fact that she is South African. She could call the president, her former husband, and basically plead upon him to bring troops in. And I think that played a bit of a role in this. It goes against the backdrop of a situation that is quite rapidly deteriorating in the Central African Republic. So I think personality also played a role, existing the need to move quite rapidly in the Central African Republic.
Dr. Adebayo, assuming that you agree with what Dr. Cillea is saying in terms of inconsistency in contributing to peacekeeping missions across our continent, is that an issue of policy? Could it be because our policy primarily says the armed forces' responsibility is to defend against external aggression as opposed to participate largely in peacekeeping operations?
Well, I think you have to see it in phases. During the Nelson Mandela administration between 1994 and 99, South Africa basically avoided large peacekeeping missions, arguing that it had to restructure its army from the apartheid era. But after Thabo Mbeki came into power in 1999, South Africa actually actively started deploying troops, both under the United Nations and the African Union's banner, to places like the DRC and Burundi, as I said. So I think that there isn't an either-or where you either defend your own territory or send peacekeepers abroad. I think every country sort of plays both roles. And South Africa is a major regional actor, just like Nigeria is in Africa. And I think it's consistent and a continuation of those policies that we had in the past. The one thing I would just add is that South Africa under Mbeki tended to defer to regional actors in their own spheres of influence. So, for example, it was asked to become involved in Sudan, but wanted IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, to take the lead. What you've seen recently was South Africa stepping into Cote d'Ivoire in terms of peacemaking, and actually stepping on some toes with ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States led by Nigeria. So I think it's been quite careful in this particular case to make sure that it's acting within the context of the bilateral framework it has with Central African Republic and consulting other players within the Economic Community of Central African States.
I'm going to ask Dr. Cillea to comment on that. But again, Dr. Adebayo, is that what the continent expects from South Africa? Is what South Africa doing exactly what the continent expects?
I think this situation is still evolving, and it's too early to really make any definitive statements on what the continent expects or not, because we don't know how it's going to develop. This is a situation where there are negotiations going on in Gabon, in Libreville, and the rebel advance on the capital of Bangui has been halted in the meantime, and it's not clear how this is all going to play out. But I think one can certainly say that the continent expects South Africa to play a leadership role on the continent, and as one of the most effective armies on the continent, along with Nigeria, Ethiopia, and others, it's expected to help provide support. But it's too early to say whether there's a big appetite and big support around the continent for protecting Bozizé, who is not seen as a model Democrat, but has ruled quite autocratically.
Well, but is that how you see it? Do you see the deployment of South African troops there as protecting Bozizé?
Well, they are intervening on behalf of his government, and the idea is that they're going to help support the government of the day from being overrun, basically. So I do think that there is a danger that South Africa could be seen as basically protecting an autocratic regime. But it should be added as well, because it's quite a nuanced and complicated subject. The African Union has a clause against unconstitutional changes of government. And so I think many African countries would not agree with a rebel approach where they're effectively staging a rebellion to topple the government, no matter how checkered its democratic record may be. Right. So that has to be added.
Dr. Cillea, 3 questions really coming out of that one. Firstly, the policy here in South Africa. Secondly, the issue of expectation. And thirdly, how do you see the situation in Bangui? Do you get a sense that South Africa will be protecting a dictator?
Let's start with the latter issue, which there is, as Ade has indicated, there's considerable ambiguity about the fact that South Africa is, in one sense, could be seen as rushing to the defense of somebody who, as Ade puts it so delicately, has a checkered background himself. But I think that the South African engagement is in line with the principle of protecting an elected government and trying to ensure that issues are increasingly dealt with by Africans. And this is on the backdrop of what happened in Libya, the NATO engagement, as well as in Côte d'Ivoire. And I think that that's the principle that South Africa is trying to deal with. When we speak about the issues of policy and expectations, Africa, in my experience on the continent, expects more from South Africa often. There is a process at the moment engaged on a white paper and a defense review on the South African National Defense Force, but there is a capability gap in South Africa. Our National Defense Force is not orientated and prepared to participate in these type of missions, and how South Africa will logistically be able to support and supply forces in Bangui is really a question. I think with the defense review process, to orientate our armed forces for their primary role, which is going to be in support of peacekeeping, regional stability, and of course then internally in support of the police and on border security.
But how can our armed forces not be prepared? Because again, if you go back 1999, you're talking about the arms deal. Certainly they acquired state-of-the-art equipment, presumably. They should be prepared for any eventuality.
Well, the reality is they've had a declining budget since around 1989, a budget that has declined very dramatically. And yet their force orientation is towards conventional defense of South Africa against foreign excursion, which, if you take a very legalistic approach to the function of our armed forces, that's what they are supposed to do. But South Africa is the largest economy in Africa. It has got armed forces that can defend and secure this country as a byproduct of preparing for its major engagement. And in today's world, you can't have the luxury of having armed forces prepare for, I would almost call it a mythical mission of defense against conventional attack, because you must ask yourself, who's going to attack us? Lesotho, Swaziland? People always speak of Angola. Angola is a country that has got decades to go before it could potentially be a regional threat to South Africa. South Africa needs simply to orientate its armed forces and the acquisitions in arms that it makes towards what its real functions, roles, and missions are going to be.